Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook live broadcast. I'm Steve Altition, Director of Client Partnerships here at Pacific Cascade Family Law. And today I'm here with Christa Bevan to talk about how to utilize your nervous system and gain nervous system literacy to become an empowered mom. Hey, Kristen, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I like to say I am a nervous system educator for cycle breaker moms. So these are moms who know that they want to parent differently than they were raised and give their kids a different childhood than the one that they experienced themselves. And I help them do that through nervous system regulation, which I know you and I are going to get into talking about. But needless to say, I didn't come to this work on accident, right? So I consider myself to be a cycle breaker mother, just alongside the mamas that I help. And I needed this to sort of break the cycles of childhood trauma that I lived with. And I knew I wanted to parent differently and offer my son this different opportunity and experience of life than the one that I was given. And for me, one of the really foundational pieces that helped me to not only sort of recover from a lot of the trauma that I had experienced, but also show up in motherhood the way that I desired was through nervous system regulation work and really starting to work with my body in some of the healing that I was doing that had been missing from the approaches that I had tried. And so once I started including that and incorporating that into my life, it was all these like light bulb moments of things shifting and going the way I wanted. And that inspired me to now do this work and share it and spread this with other mamas.
Well, I'm really happy you're here today because this to me, as I was going through it, just really fascinating stuff. I understand, I think, what constitutes our nervous system, but what do you mean by the term nervous system literacy?
Yeah. So good question, because I created this term, right? And so it's this idea of becoming literate about our nervous system. So starting to understand the way that our innate stress physiology is wired. One of the things that can happen really frequently is that we will respond to a situation in our life from a place of stress, from a place of being activated in our nervous system. And we're not always proud of how we've behaved. And then afterwards, we can feel a lot of shame and a lot of guilt around that behavior. And what I've found is that when we can actually start to learn and understand why we respond and why we respond the way that we do in certain situations, we can not only sort of prevent those from happening in the future, but at the very least, we can change how we interact with ourselves after the fact. And the biggest way that we can do that is by cultivating more compassion for ourselves, which actually helps to interrupt that shame spiral, helps to dissipate that mom guilt, and helps us get back to being the kind of mom that we want to be for our kids a little bit quicker and a little bit easier.
That sounds hard and maybe not so hard. It's really, like I said, it just fascinates me. So the nervous system, in terms of what you were talking about, regulating it to get kind of empowerment over it, can you give us kind of a brief rundown first? Like what does the nervous system actually do that you're trying to regulate?
Yeah, great question. So let's just talk about what the nervous system is, right? So it's our brain and our spinal cord, but it's so much more than that. It's also all of these nerves running through our body. And we tend to think of our brain as being in charge and running the show and sort of being the director of operations and giving our body instructions on how to behave. But the truth is that our body actually gives most of the information to our brain, and then our brain responds and reacts to that. So there's this huge subconscious component of our body really being in charge. And so when we can start to understand that, we can start to work with our body so that we aren't so betrayed by these stress responses. And then what was this? I'm sorry, you're going to have to repeat the second part of the question because I completely distracted myself in answering the first part.
That was perfect. That was perfect.
Okay.
The next kind of leads into, how does it do this? Why what is the nervous system trying to protect us from? I mean, why is it responding like that?
Yeah. So its main job is to keep us alive and to keep us safe, right? So the number one job of the nervous system is survival. And that sounds kind of obvious when you stop and think about it, but in the moment, the nervous system can actually be really myopic, and it can be responding to threats of danger that it perceives to be dangerous. So let me give you an example, right? Let me tie this into actual mom life. So if your child is having a tantrum, just like a complete meltdown in the middle of the aisle of Target, and you are completely embarrassed, that can feel like a threat to your nervous system. And it can trigger you into this place of activation where you feel like you need to act. And you might respond to your child in a way that, again, you're maybe not proud of. Maybe you yell at them. Maybe you say, snap out of it. Maybe you sort of pick them up and you say, cut it out. Or you're speaking in a tone of voice that you don't like. And it's because your body is responding to this perceived threat. We know rationally that our child having a tantrum in the middle of Target isn't actually a threat. But on a subconscious level, it feels threatening. And that's how our body is responding. And so when we start to understand that, we can, again, sort of have more compassion and understanding for why we're responding the way that we do. And also take that moment to sort of check ourselves and say, wait a minute, this feels like a big deal, but maybe it's really not. Maybe I can just take a pause, right? It gives us that space between the trigger and our reaction to go, oh, this is what's happening. This feels really scary to my body, and it's actually not. Maybe if I take a deep breath, then I can calm myself and then help calm them, and then we can get out of the store.
Yeah, it sounds like there's two parts of the brain almost going on. There's
Oh,
like the
definitely.
survival, and then there's sort of I think you call it the thinking brain. I mean, which kicks in first?
The survival brain does. And the survival brain is getting information from our body. So our body is sensing, it's constantly scanning our environment, both external and internally, which is why our self-talk matters, for cues of danger, for things that it can perceive. Again, it's all about perception. We're not talking about reality here. We're talking about perceived danger. And then it's sending information to the survival brain that has to make a split-second decision about how to interpret that information. And again, if you sort of hold this information in the context of your nervous system's number one job is to keep you alive, if it senses, wait, that's danger, then it's going to tell your upper level thinking brain, this is a dangerous situation and I need to respond, right? And the way that we respond, most people have heard of fight or flight.
Yep.
There's also freeze, or sort of a shutdown state. And those things will sometimes happen to us. And then afterwards, we sort of go, wait a minute, why did I do that? I was in the middle of an argument with my husband, and then I completely froze. I knew what I wanted to say, and I couldn't get the words out of my mouth. And then you feel bad about that, right? And there's a reason that happened, is that you perceived danger and your body shut you down to keep you safe.
So your survival brain doesn't it you said interesting thing, it's not necessarily a real threat. It's just these perceived threats. And is there something going on in your nervous system then that takes it from, oh, this isn't a real threat, let's deal with it this way?
Yeah. And it takes being in a regulated nervous system state so that you can respond to stressors in life with more accuracy. So if you have a lot of unhealed trauma in your body, because your body is where that stuff gets stored, then you start to see the world from a state of danger. And your perceptions about your world start to skew in that direction. And so if we can bring in some nervous system regulation work to get you into a place where you are not so quick to react, where you have what's called a larger window of tolerance. So it's the capacity that you have to, I like to describe it as bending to stressors in life instead of breaking under their weight, right? If we can start to expand those things and regulate your nervous system, then when those things happen, we're better able to, again, put that pause in between the triggering event and our reaction. Not to say that we never react to things off the cuff, but we're able to often slow that process down and let our thinking brain sort of go, wait a minute, is this actually dangerous? Or is this just somebody that cut me off in traffic? Is this just my boss pushing a work deadline and I'm actually okay? Or is it just, the nightly news that I can flip the channel on, right? And we can then sort of have a little bit more agency over how we respond to those things.
It reminds me so much of the sort of thing I talk to my kids about sometimes, which is they get into I will call it a texting war. And someone's texting and they're going here, hitting things. And I go, are you really sure you want to send that? I mean, that's kind of what your thinking brain is, but it doesn't have time to do it. It sounds like if you don't figure out a way to slow down the process.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And it can happen, with our kids, with different relationships that we're in, right? We can just have just reactivity. And instead we want to be able to actually shift back and say, I'm happy to have this conversation, but I need 5 minutes. I need to gather my thoughts, right? It's about being able to put boundaries in place. It's about being able to advocate for yourself. It's about having the empowerment enough to know this is how I'm feeling like I need to react. And I know that that's not actually true to the moment. And I don't want to do something I'm ashamed of. And so I'm going to stop myself and advocate for what I need. I can talk about this with you, but I'm not going to do it over email. I will only have this conversation in person. Or this is the situation in which I feel most comfortable discussing this. Or I'm not discussing this, but I'm happy to talk about this piece of the conversation, whatever it is. But it's about being able to sort of have that control and, again, agency over what happens to you and how you respond to the world.
When it's all working, like you said, they were supposed to be together. You should have the survival brain, you should have the thinking brain, and they just got to work together. And you had brought up a term that I kind of want to ask about, because that brought up a question with me. Is you said one of the reactions, it's not just the fight or flight. It can be this thing called freeze.
Mm-hmm.
What is freeze? And is that kind of what I'm thinking is you shut down and don't do anything? And what is that?
Yeah, so it can literally be that you become sort of frozen in place, right? This is a classic one that a lot of women experience, where they can't talk. They sort of will literally stop moving and just sort of check out, right? But it can also show up in sort of more subtle ways. So it can be freezing in the sense of not being able to advocate for yourself, right? So if you think about fighting or flighting, they're both very physical acts. You're doing something to save yourself. You're either fighting the bear or you're running away from the bear. Freeze is where your body has made the decision that those two things, fighting or flighting, aren't going to work. And so instead, you're going to shut down, you're going to dissociate from your body as a self-protection mechanism so that you don't feel the pain of the impending threat coming at you. And sometimes that looks like hiding from your life. It can be sort of shut down in the sense that you're kind of moving through the motions, but you're not really there. You're not really participating fully. Maybe, you respond to a stressful event in a freeze state and it sort of knocks you off your game for a really long time. It takes you a long time to sort of come back, to sort of bounce back to your full self. Maybe you're sleeping excessively. Maybe you're sort of hiding from responsibilities, right? Those can all sort of be in the flavor of the freeze response, so to speak.
Can you get stuck? And I guess what I mean by that is, even if reacting quickly or freezing, can you kind of get into that mode where it happens and it's hard to get out of it? Because it sounds like, the thinking brain is trying to knock on the door and say, let me in, but sometimes that doesn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what we would call a chronic state of nervous system dysregulation. And it can be existing in either a state of fighting, right? So this would look like, chronic, again, like yelling at your kids, being sort of aggressive, being difficult for people to deal with you, being overly just like aggressive, right? Or flighting, where you're sort of anxious and you have this anxious energy in your body, or you're always trying to control things, or you're overcompensating, right? These can be sort of those hyper aroused states, or it can be something like a freeze, like a hypo aroused state. So something like depression is often in this category, or again, that sort of checked out feeling, sort of like you're going through the motions but you're not really there. You're sort of showing up to your life in this very superficial way. And then sometimes what happens to people too is they bounce back and forth from one extreme to the next. And they kind of, oscillate back and forth, but we can become, like you said, for lack of a better word, sort of stuck in these response patterns where that's sort of how we see the world and how we interact with the world. So I'll give you an example from my own life. For years and years and years, everyone just told me I was an angry person. They just said I was angry. They always thought I was angry. They always thought my face looked angry. They thought my tone of voice was angry. They thought the way I responded was always angry. And so I started thinking, well, I must be an angry person. They must be right. All these people in my life are telling me this. And then come to find out, I'm actually not an angry person. I can get angry, but I was a severely dysregulated person. And what my nervous system had done was basically assessed the world to be dangerous. And the best way that my body felt that I could cope with that was through anger as a protective mechanism. And so it sort of became this defensive shield that I wore around even when I didn't need it, because my body didn't know how to set it down. It didn't have other skills to replace the coping skill of anger and that sort of fight energy that I knew. And so a lot of times we can develop these sort of patterns and kind of become stuck in not knowing what else to do, where nervous system regulation work is going to help us sort of break out of those patterns and out of those habitual ruts.
That sounds like it's where the literacy comes in.
Yeah.
Knowing, I guess you have to kind of understand it before you can try to fix it, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Right. I'm always telling clients that alteration follows awareness. We can't change what we don't know to change. So first we become aware of these things. We start to recognize these patterns. Then we start to understand sort of the root of the pattern. And then we look at what we can do to shift that. What can we do to augment the pattern? And those sort of 3 steps kind of work together to give people an opportunity to really change the story for themselves.
Start on the first one. How do you recognize it? The problem?
Yeah. So this one, it's a great question and it doesn't have a great answer. It's one of those things where you have to just start to notice. You have to start hearing enough people say, God, why are you always so angry? You have to start feeling like there's something in your life that just isn't quite right, right? It's sort of an intuitive knowing that something's not the way that it should be, to get you to start asking questions to go, is this really the best that life can be? Is this how I'm supposed to be reacting to my children? Is this the kind of mom that I want to be? Is this the kind of, whatever, fill in the blank? And then that through that curiosity, we can start asking questions that open up some of these doorways to more exploration.
I take it this is kind of the stage a lot of people come to you at. They're maybe starting to recognize. So let's say someone comes to you, and how do you start to break that pattern?
So the first thing we do is we start to look at what the pattern is. We start to say, is there a pattern? When you face this certain stressor, I call them stress hotspots in your life, right? Is it every time that you need to go to the grocery store, does your anxiety kick in? Is that a pattern that we can recognize? Okay, so let's look at that. What can we do? How can we work with that? How can we honor the fact that your body is having this anxious reaction? It's there for a reason. Can we accept what that reason is and then change that reason is existing? Or can we change the way that you interact with that stressor? Can we order groceries to be delivered to your house, right? What can we do to manage that anxiety? And we can start to work on tools to work with the body. So I do a lot of embodiment work, and a lot of different brain science based tools to really get people to come into safety in their body. Because again, when we're talking about the nervous system and the survival brain, we're really mostly talking about the body's responses to things. So the best way, I think, and a lot of people agree with me, to approach working with that is to work with the body. So using somatic approaches to start to shift some of these things and start to move out of those patterns so that you can create that new story for yourself.
What kind of work? You're working with the body. Is this like physical stuff? Because I know you said earlier that it isn't just the brain, and it's not necessarily being, run by the brain. It's your whole nervous system. And that made sense when you talk about someone who just has an angry face. It's just sort of your nervous system is doing it. So what sort of physical things do sometimes you have people do to try to break or stop that or slow it down?
Yeah. So there's breath work is one option. There's intentional movement. There's intentional movement exercises that we can do. I was actually just doing one of them before we hopped on this call. It's this really, I can show it to you. It's this really simple movement to sort of get everything firing in the right way. And you literally just, it's like rocking a baby. You sort of rock the baby down here, and then you move up, and then you move up. Right. And so it's things like this. It's these little hacks that work with our body's physiology. So in this case, what we're doing is firing up the trapezius muscles to activate the vagus nerve, to tell the vagus nerve that our body is safe. It can sort of act as like a little reset through our day. So we use things like that. It's yoga postures, it's breath work. It's also one of the modalities that I teach clients is called TRE, which is tapping into the body's innate ability to shake as a stress discharge function. So there's lots of different things that we can do that are sort of working with the body to release the stress hormones that have accumulated in our systems and allow those to sort of dissipate, which helps us to recognize maybe things aren't quite as unsafe as I'm perceiving them to be right now. Maybe I actually am feeling better, right? So people also do things like, for anyone listening that likes to run, I am not that person, but I hear after you go for a long run that you feel better afterwards, right? You sort of get that runner's high, and you get those natural endorphins and the oxytocin and all of these things that are working with your system and your stress physiology to produce a state change to help you feel better. So it's knowing those things and then mindfully implementing them in your life.
Yeah, you're not just running away from the problem. You're running to understand the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems to me that it makes sense also because, so many people that I talk to, maybe everybody, one of the times that it seems like some of this either perceived danger kicks in and anxiety is when you go to bed and you're lying in bed. And get out of bed and actually do some of these things is because it seems like I'm just lying there, or people are just lying there. And the more you lie there, the more it kind of compounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for me, once I hit bed, I don't usually want to get up and out and to do anything. But this is where an ounce of prevention is really worth a pound of cure. And this is what I teach clients is, what are the things we can do on a regular basis to nourish our nervous system? What are the things, can we start to recognize the things that trigger us, that put us into this activated state? And then can we also create a custom list for ourselves of things that can help us reset and regulate ourselves, right? So for me, I just said running is a great one, except I hate running. So running is never going to be on my list. But for my sister, running is one of the things that helps her keep her cool. So what are the things that you can do that would work with your body that you can start to incorporate into your life in this mindful way in order to prevent that point that you get to where you're laying in bed and then just sort of spiraling into that place, right?
So the list isn't something you necessarily tell them. Do A, B, C, D, and E, and F, because the list could be different for different people.
Yeah, it's more like I give them a menu and ask them to order the things that
Yeah.
that they like. Yeah.
Yeah. The can I write this down? I mean, should I be writing this down? I mean, is that something that I always think about, that taking notes? I mean,
Yeah.
is it you go, oh, this isn't that bad, and I should not do this, and maybe I should, and recognize when I recognize something, should I like write it down, or just sort of, is it just the process of doing it over and over again sort of intuitively brings you to recognizing it?
I think for a lot of people, writing it down can be really helpful. And in fact, I often tell people to write it down, have a list. So when I work with people, we create a resources for regulation roadmap, right? And I help people create this custom menu for themselves. And then I say, print it out and put it on your fridge. Print it out and hand it to your partner, and they can remind you. Because here's the thing, is that when we get in this triggered state, when we're feeling anxious, it's really hard to use our thinking brain to remember, oh, if I just do this, that'll help me feel better. And so when we have this like physical document, or put it in the notepad on your phone, if we have it sort of external to ourselves, it can be a really great way to look at it as a reference and then say, oh yeah, I'm going to try this thing. And if this doesn't work, I'm going to try the next thing. And at a certain point, it will become intuitive to just know what you need to do. But I do find that for people beginning, it can be very helpful to create a list for yourself.
I mean, yeah. Part of the problem it would seem also is that if you've got 14 things to do, and you're between 9 and 10, and you suddenly start to feel this way, I mean, don't I have to get on to number 11 thing I have to do right off the bat?
I mean, that's our tendency, right? That's
Yeah.
the curse that all Americans need to break, is this constant productivity drive. And that's what I mean about, working this stuff into your life. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes practice, right? We've all gotten to this place where we value productivity over rest. And we need to all step away from that more than we are, I think. And, this is part of it, is really because rest and downtime, if we think about this from sort of an evolutionary standpoint, our nervous systems are not evolved to live in the time that we live in, because they were used to having a threat happen and then the threat would go away. And
Yeah.
instead, what we deal with is a constant barrage of unending threats, right? And again, threat in the perception land, not in reality land. And so when we don't build in time to our schedules, and we don't build in permission to ourselves to allow for time for our nervous system to recalibrate to safety, I mean, of course, we're all a bunch of anxious messes. So we really need to start to shift the way that we show up in our day, changing how we schedule our lives, changing the way that we interact with events and things like that, so that we can really build in some recovery time. And I think that that's just a practice, and that you can get good at it. I have gotten much better at it in my life. And if I can do it, I promise that anyone can.
I believe it. I mean, because just you're talking about it, it all just makes sense. It even though wouldn't think about it, when you talk about it, it makes sense. And just even listening to it kind of brings you back to being intentional. I mean, just kind of hearing it.
Yeah.
We're getting close to being have to go, but I just kind of want to touch on the sort of stress hormone thing you talked about, and how maybe hitting again how what do you do with them when they start to flood, and is there a way to know it's coming? I guess is the kind of the question.
I mean, knowing it's coming, I mean, yeah, we can sometimes predict the stress in our life, right? So goes back to the stress hotspots that I was mentioning. Like if there's if getting your kids to daycare in the morning and then getting yourself to work all within the 15, you might recognize that that's a stress hotspot, and you can sort of anticipate that's going to be a stressful event. And then you can do things to sort of try to lessen those effects. But also stress can hit us out of nowhere, right? And what it does on a physiological level is it causes a spike, a surge in stress hormones. So things like cortisol and adrenaline running through our body. And those are happening to prepare us to fight or flight and run away from this threat. And if we don't do one of those things, those stress hormones are still in our body. And we know that when our heart is racing, when our hands are sweaty, when we sort of feel jacked up, like we've had too much coffee. And so we can do things to sort of discharge that feeling from our body, use those stress hormones up, right? That's where physical movement can come in. But it's also things like co-regulating with a safe person. So it's what I like to call the phone a friend option, right? I think we all know this sort of instinctually. We've had a long, hard day. Somebody said something really crappy to us. And what do? We call our mom, we call our sister, we call our best friend, and you vent about your day, right? There's ways to work with your stress anatomy to let the stress valve open up a little bit and let some of those things discharge in a healthy way instead of in a way that's yelling at your kids.
That makes complete sense. This has been really cool. Somehow we just ripped through 30 minutes. Before we go, is there anything you kind of want to, one last comment or a tip or something about kind of, not feeling shame? Because it's one of the things that I kind of caught was, it's like, you can do all these things, and because the things aren't bad. I mean, these things, these reactions, these stress, they're not bad things. You need them, but it's just a matter of getting to turn them off. It seems like is where the ship goes wrong.
Yeah. Well, you asked me this question and then you say you want it to be a quick tip. So I'll do my best, but you tricked me here. But I think, this is just one thing to know about this. And I don't say this to make you feel bad, but instead to say this to make you understand the possibility of what can happen when you do this work, which is that your self-talk matters. And that can be as much danger to your system as any external threat. And so I want everyone listening to this to pay attention to how you speak to yourself after you behave in a way that you're maybe not proud of, or when you're lying in bed at night trying to fall asleep and you're replaying your day. Just start to have an awareness of what that language is like, and start to ask yourself the question, would I speak to my child the way that I'm speaking to myself? And see if that gets you to change what some of that inner dialogue is like. And I have a feeling that for a lot of us, it would.
That makes sense. That makes so much sense. So obviously, folks work with you on this. This isn't you just give them a book and they walk away.
No.
So how can people get a hold of you?
So you can head to my website, which is christabevan.com. And you can find ways to work with me on there. I also host a podcast as well as a free Facebook community for other moms that are doing this work. And both of those have the same name, which is the Radical Mother Village. So if you search for that in your podcast platform or on Facebook, it'll pop up and you can find me in those places as well.
I love it. We are now out of time.
Okay.
But I really appreciate you coming. And I totally now want to do one on the Radical Mother Village.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah. That sounds great. But really, what you did here again is, you somehow took, science and behavior and just a lot of concepts and made them understandable. Because I think if people just thought, nervous system literacy, I wouldn't know what the heck you're talking about, but now I kind of do. So
well, good.
Thank you so much for being here today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it was wonderful. And everyone else, thank you for joining us. If anyone has any questions at all on today's topic, post it here. We can get you connected with Christa. And until next time, everyone, stay safe, stay happy, be well.